All right, we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm the Associate Director of Indie and Library Marketing at Kensington Publishing. And I'm here with 5 authors today, and we're going to talk about their books. They're coming out this summer, earlier this summer, and also later this summer, and we're calling these our Great Summer Reads. So first, I'm going to introduce Kevin O'Brien, author of The Enemy at Home. And I'll come back to him in a moment. We also have with us Katie Siegel, author of Charlotte Isles is Not a Detective. Phyllis R. Dixon, the author of Intermission, is here. Lorena Hughes is here as well. She has written The Queen of the Valley. And last but not least, Kelsey James is here to discuss The Woman in the Castello. So I want to go back to the first author I mentioned, Kevin. Why don't you give us like a rundown of what The Enemy at Home is about and a little bit about how you came to write it?
Oh, well, The Enemy at Home is my first historical thriller. I've written 24 thrillers before that. In fact, I think you can maybe see one of them behind me, Left for Dead, and been at this for about, since 1995. I've been writing thrillers. So, and with Kensington, and hit the New York Times bestseller list a few times. So suddenly I'm Kevin O'Brien, New York Times best-selling author. That's my whole name. It's on my driver's license like that. No, it isn't, but if I could, I'd do that way. I've been doing contemporary thrillers all this time, and I've always been interested in the home front during World War II, and just been passionate about it, and wanted to write a story about a serial killer before the term serial killer was even coined. It wasn't coined until the 1970s. And I came up with this idea about Rosie the Riveter, who solves some serial killings that are going on in Seattle during the war. And just had a really great time researching it and a lot of fun putting it out there. So this is my first trade paperback. I've been a mass market paperback guy for a long time. So it feels really great. I'm looking forward to it coming out. So it's The Enemy at Home. Comes out August 22nd. Check it out.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin.
Sure.
Katie, do you want to talk about Charlotte Isles, how you came up with it, and what it's briefly about?
Yeah, I would love to. Charlotte Isles is Not a Detective is my debut novel. It originated as a TikTok video, might possibly be the first ever book adaptation of a TikTok, which is very wacky and fun. But yeah, it's about a former child detective named Charlotte Isles. When she was young, she had this very big detective career, as like so many young detectives we've read about in fiction. And but now she's 25 and she is long since put that behind her. But she finds herself kind of getting pulled back into mystery solving, dusting off a little bit reluctantly, pulled back into mystery solving by her family and friends. And yeah, that's Charlotte Isles, comes out June 27th.
Thank you. Phyllis, we have you next with Intermission. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Intermission is the story of 4 women who during the 90s were a multiracial girl group, and they had some success, and they were just on the verge of pop crossing over into pop success, and then they broke up. So it's now 20 years later. The 1990s are the good old days, and there's an opportunity for them to reunite and tour. And there's a crisis in each one of their lives that is the impetus for the tour. But there's one small thing, and that's that they all vowed never to speak again. So the intermission is the story of how they get back together, if they get back together, and just coming forward from not necessarily mistakes, but how they get past the trauma and hurt feelings from 20 years ago and how they get to today.
Excellent. Thank you. Lorena, you're next with The Queen of the Valley.
I'm next. Okay. So The Queen of the Valley is the sequel to The Spanish Daughter. So I'm going to try not to give away spoilers. The Queen of the Valley starts 5 years after The Spanish Daughter ends. It is set in Colombia in 1925, and our protagonist, Puri, now owns a chocolate store in Ecuador. She has hasn't gone back to her native country, but she has established her new life with her new family in Ecuador. However, there is a man that she met a few years ago in the previous novel who has moved to Colombia and has acquired the cacao plantation of his dreams, and he is her only supplier of cacao beans. One day, the shipments stopped coming, and Martin vanishes. That's the name of the man. He vanishes, and she has developed a strong attachment to him. I won't say why, but she has. So she decides to go to Colombia and find him. And so after a long and dangerous journey, which includes an earthquake that actually did happen in Cali in 1925, she arrives to the hacienda, but Martin is gone, and the hacienda has been turned into a hospital, a Catholic hospital dealing with earthquake victims and an emerging cholera epidemic. So Puri, who's now the queen, the master of disguise, decides to pose as a nun in order to stay in the hospital and find out what happened to Martin. Along the way, she'll meet some friends from Martin's past, who include a doctor who was very quick to turn the hacienda into a hospital, a photographer who claims to be one of Martin's best friends from his childhood, and also a nun who is the daughter of Arab immigrants in Colombia and who seems to have a bitter past with Martin. All of these so-called friends and a few others seem to have motives to want Martin gone, and Puri is there to find out what happened. So when she does in fact she will eventually find out what happens, but most importantly, what is to become of her. So The Queen of the Valley is scheduled for publication in August, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
Thank you, Lorena. Kelsey, do you want to talk about The Woman in the Castello? This is coming out late
July 25th. Yes, so The Woman in the Castello is set during the Hollywood on the Tiber era, so 1960s in Italy. And it tells the story of Sylvia Whitford, who arrives for her big break in Rome. She, got a part in a movie, and she's relocating with her ailing mother and her 2-year-old daughter. And she finds out that the movie she's been cast in is canceled. It's out of money, and she's almost out of money. So she's in super desperate circumstances, and she decides to seek out her mother is Italian, and she seeks out her mother's estranged sister, who her mother has made her swear never, to talk about, but she sees no other options. And so she finds her in this crumbling castello by a lake in a little village outside of Rome. And she ends up, reconnecting with her and then getting cast in another movie that is set in this castello. I won't explain how all that comes to be, but and she, soon after the movie begins, her aunt disappears mysteriously, and no one is worried about what happened to her except for Sylvia. And some of the elements of the horror movie being shot in the castello start to seep into reality.
Thank you. That is a good description of the book. Okay, so I'm going to return to Kevin, author of The Enemy at Home. Can you talk about Nora Kinney as your lead character? Talk about her backgrounds and what you like most about her.
Oh, good question. Well, Nora is 37 years old, and she's the mother of 2. Her husband is a doctor, and he's away with the Army Medical Corps in North Africa. It's 1943 in Seattle, and she's decided to do her part for the war effort, and she she's only had one job her whole life, and that was a brief stint as a soda fountain jerk in back when she was in high school. And so this is her first actual job besides raising kids and being a homemaker and all that stuff. And so she's kind of up for the challenge. I'm a big movie fan, and I based her kind of on James Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. So she's George Bailey. She's a female George Bailey, and I didn't realize how many similarities were there. She's kind of like, there's a line in It's a Wonderful Life where his father tells him, "You were born old, George," and that's sort of Nora. She's born old. She takes on a lot of responsibility. She raises her kid brother starting when she's 9 years old. Her mother has postpartum depression and ends up dying in an institution of Spanish flu, because that's what was going on around then. So there are a lot of similarities between the times of the pandemic and World War II. But what I like about Nora the most is the fact that she's got a sense of accountability and responsibility, and she's always wants to do the right thing. And so I think that's part of her joining the army of women workers that are helping to win the war. So that's what I like about her.
Thank you. Katie, you had said this before, but Charlotte Isles came about when you created the TikTok series, and then you developed her into having her own book. Where did you get the idea for Charlotte Isles is Not a Detective? Both when you started off doing the TikTok series and now as you grew it into a novel.
Yeah, so my genuine honest answer is I really don't remember. I mean, I grew up with all these child detectives, Encyclopedia Brown, Cam Jansen, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Boxcar Children. So that's just always been, a part of me growing up. And the TikTok originally came around because I had just wrapped up a web series called Lavinia Wada Isn't Afraid of Ghosts, which I apparently really like titles that are something, not something, not a purposeful thing at all. And I was trying to come up with an idea for a new web series. And so I came up with the idea of doing sort of like a pilot season for my followers to have them kind of choose what they wanted to see next. So I came up with 3 pilots for potential web series that I would do on TikTok. And one of the ideas that I came up with during that time was about a former kid detective who got pulled back into mystery solving. And that one ended up being wildly popular. And so that's how that all came to be. And what happened with that is that my now editor, Shannon, saw that, reached out to me and said, "Hey, this sounds like it'd be a fun book. Would you be interested in pitching this to my publisher?" So I ended up writing a whole, summary of the book and everything about the characters and everything. So that was the time that I really had to expand beyond what I had come up with for this web series. That's another thing. If anyone has seen the web series or watches the web series, the book is far beyond that. It goes well beyond that. So no worries about spoilers or anything like that. But yeah, then it became about developing a bigger story out of what began as just a short little, originally just a short little TikTok and then a slightly longer little web series. But yeah, I then lost my train of thought. But that I think that was everything, right? That's how it kind of came to be. And now what was once a video is now a book. And I kind of see the two as existing in sort of like alternate universes, even though the book is based off of the first video. They have similarities, but they're in different worlds. And the story of the book was kind of kickstarted by just one moment in the web series where Charlotte's friend Lucy she's pretending to be a delivery worker on the phone to distract someone. And that kind of got the gears rolling for a bigger mystery that is in the book. So yeah, that's that whole saga.
Yeah, it's funny. It's neat to see scenes that I read in the book. I went back and looked at the series, and they're sort of the same, but they're
Yeah.
in location
You
and
see whispers. There's whispers of connection between the two, definitely.
and really quickly, did you immediately see that blow up, the series, the TikTok?
Yeah, it pretty quickly was popular. Like I said, especially compared to the other two that I put out. I think that one went out like the first day, and then I put out like 2 others in the consecutive days, and it was like far beyond the others, a lot more popular. But yeah, I mean, it's continued to grow and more people have discovered it as it goes, but it was pretty initially very popular, and thankfully so, because otherwise my editor might not have ever seen it and we might not be here today. So the
Well,
power of the
thank you.
internet.
Thank you, Katie. Phyllis, your career started with you working as a bank examiner. Now, how did you go from there to being a writer?
Well, it sounds like a big jump, but at its core, it's basically the same thing, and that's storytelling. And so, of course, as a bank examiner, we're focused on the numbers. So, we look at transactions. But one of the things that always interested me was the story behind the numbers. So we look at, one of the main things we did was look at loans, which is the largest asset in a bank. And so we looked at everyone from, say, Donald Trump to Farmer Joe in Iowa. And so one of the things that always interested me was, why do they need this money? How did they get in this business? So we would have to write a summary of that. So it was writing a summary of the individual and their loans, and then also writing a summary about the bank. So like I say, at its core, it's the same thing, and that's, writing a summary. And then, so of course, doing this, I worked, all across the country and spent a lot of time on the road in hotels. So, on the road, some people drink, some people shop, some people knit, some people fool around. And I just stayed in my room and wrote down stories of all these stories and people and things that were swimming around in my head. And along the way, when I lived in Houston, I actually opened a bookstore because I was not thinking of writing. That was not considered a viable career to me. So I opened a bookstore, and that kind of married my love of reading with my business degree. And while having the bookstore, I met, a lot of authors that came in for, book signings and presentations. And many of them are now quite prolific, but at the time, they were just starting out. They were selling books out of their car. They had their day jobs. And so that kind of made me think, well, if they can do this, I can do it too. And so 20 years later, here I am.
I'm so glad you brought up the bookstore. I was going to ask you about that if you didn't. That's how long did you own that?
8 years.
That's wonderful.
In the 1990s. So.
Well, thank you. Lorena, The Queen of the Valley features 3 protagonists: a Palestinian Colombian nun, a photographer, and a Spanish chocolatier disguised as a novice nun. And you said, like you said before, they're connected to Martin Sabater, the missing hacienda owner. How did you develop each of those 3 lead characters? And was like their general diversity a natural part of their evolution as a character? Or was it a historical note that you really wanted to emphasize?
Okay, so I'll start with the Palestinian Colombian nun. So my family are Arab immigrants in Ecuador. My grandfather immigrated first. He was the oldest of a few, several brothers, and they were poor. So he traveled around. He went first to Germany, to Chile, eventually settled in Ecuador because of the weather. And then he sent out for a bride. And this bride was my grandmother, who was 15 years old. Her parents told her, hey, you have to move to Ecuador and marry your cousin. She was like, well, where is Ecuador? What? Yeah, I don't speak Spanish and I don't know this cousin. And they're like, doesn't matter, you have to go. So she went with some uncle of hers. So she arrived in Ecuador. They started taking her measurements and making her dress. And a month later, she was married. So that story inspired me to include a family of Arab immigrants in the Queen of the Valley. Camila is not the only Palestinian Colombian in the story. Her brother, who is also an important character, and he is the doctor that ends up turning the hacienda into a hospital. So both of them are important. I wanted to bring this kind of not very well-known story of Arab immigrants in Latin America. There is a lot of them. And I thought it would be interesting to include something a little bit personal to the story. And I do bring up, like I have borrowed the story of my grandparents and made them Camila's parents. And so she is the first generation there, Arab. As far as Lucas, so he's the photographer, the 20th century photography. I studied painting and photography and fine arts in college. And I was always intrigued by how much photography and how many changes in art happened in the 19th and early 20th century. And I wanted to bring that a little bit into the book. My interest in photography, I am now a photographer as well. And so I wanted to bring that in a little bit. My dad told me the story of a friend of his who inherited a little photo studio in his hometown and hated it and was terrible at it. And I thought it would be kind of fun to give some of those traits to my character. But that throughout the story learns that he is himself an artist. And so maybe he doesn't hate it as much as he thinks he does, but he does have a quest of his own. And so that just came about because things are not very like literal, like, or how should I say, like very clear, like inspiration comes from a variety of different places for me. It's not that like I set out and I say, okay, I'm now going to tell the story of, like it just kind of happens organically. And Puri, who is the protagonist of The Spanish Daughter, I've mentioned this before, the inspiration for her came from a variety of sources, and one of them was a Spanish inventor, woman named Maria Purificación Garcia, who patented one of the first cacao bean roasters in 1847. And so in wanting to write about her maybe, and I read about women who cross-dressed in history, because the first book, she dresses as a man. And so there's just a lot of stuff that came into the Puri character that now, like, I know her like my sister, like I've written so much about her. It just is very organic with her. And so it was natural for her as a character to have her disguised now as someone else to find out a different mystery. And so I was always been fascinated by nuns and why do they make the decision they do, of living this very harsh life, very, very restricted life. And so that kind of came about as well. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does. Yeah. Well said. Okay, Kelsey. Early in The Woman in the Castello, the protagonist, Sylvia, is seeking out her aunt, Gabriella, who she's never met because of a family estrangement. Gabriella reminded me and some of my colleagues of Miss Havisham from Great Expectations. Did you make that intentional? And can you speak about Gabriella's character a little bit, particularly in relation to her, niece Sylvia?
I love this question. I wish I could say it was deliberate. It was not deliberate, but I love that comparison. I think Miss Havisham is definitely one of the original great Gothic characters for sure. And I think when I read Great Expectations, however many years ago, I'm sure it made some kind of subconscious impression on me, just like what Lorena was saying, like we get little bursts of inspiration from all kinds of places that we may not even be aware of. So thank you for drawing my attention to this one. But I do think there are some interesting similarities. I think the key one for me with Miss Havisham and Gabriella is they're both hiding themselves away in their grand houses that symbolize their regrets. So Gabriella, she said, this cursed pile of stones is my albatross. She tells Sylvia that early in the book. And it, for her, is, she had these riches that are now waning, that she chose, her fame and her ambition over her family. And so she's had to really sit with that and stay in that house for many, many years, kind of realizing, what she chose. And so but I think that also leads to the important difference with Miss Havisham is, Miss Havisham was begins as she's kind of cruel. She's a villain. And Gabriella, I think, she has come to terms with the mistakes she made, and she's actually really actively trying to mend fences when Sylvia shows back up in her life. So she, I think, has really come to regret, the things that she's done. And I think, Sylvia does, I think, come to sympathize with that over the course of the book. Sylvia, family loyalty is everything to her. Her main motivation is caring for her family. Taking care of her daughter and her mother is really at the core of everything she does. But at the same time, as we see her get her own real shot at fame, we do see her duty and her ambition, start to come into conflict, and see her struggle with that a little bit. And so I think that gives her a little more understanding, maybe, for what Gabriella went through.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. Okay, Kevin, we're moving back to you. Where other World War II fiction is focused on like the war front. The Enemy at Home takes place in Seattle, where women were newly considered workers after most of the men went off to war. Can you talk about the research that you put into this time period and the setting, and how it specifically affects the narrative?
Well, sure. Well, I love doing the research. It was almost, in fact, as I said earlier, I turned out like a book a year every year. In fact, when I first found that thrillers were my niche, I had written a couple of mainstream novels, and with Kensington published something called The Next to Die, and it turned into a USA Today bestseller. And so John Saul, the thriller author, the horror author, told me, he's like, well, from now on, it's a book a year, a thriller a year, and you can't let people down. So I've been doing that for like over 20 years. And I finally decided, I want to do something set in a different time period, and I want to take a year off because I'm like retirement age. So I picked the year of the pandemic. What a perfect year to not do anything but research. And I had a blast researching all the things that went on during the war that we don't even think about. I found out information that, like, for example, the Japanese invaded 2 islands right off the Alaska coast that were part of Alaska. So the Japanese did invade part of the well, we weren't the United States then, but they were on our coast. They also bombarded 2 coastline cities. Santa Barbara, an oil field got torpedoed by a submarine, and in Oregon there was another bombardment, and this helped lead to the Japanese-American internment that went on, and that's covered in the book as well. She has a neighbor who ends up going to an internment camp, somebody she was renting her garage to, my heroine. And it was a fascinating time because a lot of people's rights were non-existent suddenly. That's including the Japanese Americans. Gays, for example, were just totally still something under the radar, and yet they were definitely present there, and women were suddenly coming into their own. Blacks didn't have many rights; they were not being paid as much, and yet all these different types of people were all coming together in the cities and working in the factories suddenly for the first time. So it was just a really interesting time, and with the blackout regulations, the food restrictions, gas, meat shortages. Anyway, it was fun to do all the research. One of the interesting things about research is you have to let go of so much stuff that you're like, oh, damn, I can't include this in it. And one of the funnest things I read about was the Boeing factory was putting out all the B-52s. They had to have a fake roof that looked like a little town, and it was all like in miniature. It was like fiberglass and put together with spit and baling wires, they say, of like little houses and everything else that were like just this fake city, so that if the Japanese came to bomb, they wouldn't be able to find where the factory was. So I couldn't use it. I wanted a dead body in that little fake town, but I couldn't use it. But some of the research, I had such a great time looking at some of the videos. There's a great John Huston film called Let There Be Light that's available on YouTube. You can check it out, about returning war veterans with PTSD before they even had a name for it. And bring your Kleenex, because it's heart-wrenching. And there's a great video called God, I'm having a senior moment. It's called, wait a minute, Coming Out Under Fire, which is about gays in the military, and that we don't even think about, that their presence in World War II and how they had no rights. And it's just fascinating stuff. Jamie Ford's Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet was wonderful fiction that let me know a lot about the Japanese American internment. Our Mother's War by Emily Yellen was a fantastic book about women's roles in World War II. And there's so many movies I watched, fiction and documentaries, and probably the best documentary on World War II is Ken Burns' The War. So check that out. Definitely. It's I've seen it like at least 6 or 7 times before I even wanted to start writing this book. I was a big fan of that. So anyway, I'm becoming the panel hog. I went on too long. So, but you're getting me started about something I'm passionate about.
That's great. No, thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, Katie, the way you structured the book with the chapter titles, I mean, it's like, chapter 1, chapter 2, but then you get to like a little subheading for your chapter, and there are all these very amusing, quirky little phrases. Now, like, where did that come from? Like, did you read another writer, or was there another artist that kind of inspired that? Or was it just sort of like, that's the way it is? Like, that's just how I see it in my head. Like,
yeah, I love a fun chapter title. I think more authors should title their chapters. I feel like it's very underutilized nowadays. I mean, it to each their own, but I love it when I open a book and I see that they have chapter titles. It gets me excited to read. I grew up on the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, and he's got some good titles. He's got some good chapter titles. I think a lot of people my age who grew up with those books can pinpoint those books as a significant contributor to their sense of humor. So I think that was definitely a big influence for me. And I didn't really I don't remember making a conscious decision that yes, I'm gonna have fun chapter titles. I think it was something that I just started doing. And I think that there was definitely a chance that I was thinking if I run out of ideas, I'll just cut the whole thing and I won't do the chapter titles. But I kept coming up with ideas. Even there were some chapters that I knew what was coming in the chapter, and I would already have the chapter title in my head. And then sometimes there would be a line or something that would come up while writing that I would be like, this is the chapter title, this is it. And then there were some titles that I even went back and changed after the fact, during editing or during rereading. I'd come up with a different idea. But yeah, I like to say that my best friend's favorite chapter title is called Dale's Room (derogatory). She loves that one. I told her that I'm gonna print out that one page of the book and frame it for her so she can put it up. My favorite chapter title is Take Your Adult Sister to Work Day, is my personal favorite. But yeah, that's love a fun chapter title. I think it spices things up a little bit, gets people excited to jump into the chapter, I hope.
it does. And it's a little ambiguous too, like Dale's Room (derogatory). You could think about that
What
for
does
a
that
minute and not
mean?
really know
Yeah.
what it's about,
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Phyllis, many of the settings in Intermission are towns with large African-American populations and notable music scenes. Can you tell us a little bit about the cities you selected to include and how they influenced the development of the characters?
Okay. Well, Intermission takes place in Memphis, Chicago, and Houston. And those are all cities that I'm very familiar with, although primarily the story is in Memphis and Chicago. And Memphis has such a rich history. I've lived here for a little over 20 years. And it's ranked as something that I didn't know before I came here talking about the research that you were mentioning. It's ranked as the #1 city mentioned in lyrics of all cities in the world. It's Memphis. And then also we have the, after the White House, the next visited residence is Elvis's Graceland. So, it's, Memphis and music are, intertwined. Of course, we have Beale Street, all of that. So Memphis was an easy setting to base a record company, and that's the basic primary setting for the story. And then Chicago also has a music scene. But the other significance of Chicago is that it was a major destination during the Great Migration, in pretty much the first half of the 20th century for African Americans going north. And so it also has deep musical roots as well. Now, the other thing about Memphis is you have a lot of people here who, and I know this probably isn't politically correct, but a lot of people who used to be somebody. And so people that are from here or that live here, they're just very nonchalant about it all. But I'm always excited when I meet somebody who, was in the music business or whatever. I was on a plane with Isaac Hayes, Anita Ward, the Ring My Bell lady. She's actually was a school teacher in the Memphis City Schools. I think she's retired now, but she was a school teacher. And so one of my characters in Intermission is also a school teacher. I met Carla Thomas in the restroom at the library. And I was so excited. I came home and I told my family, and they were like, who is she? So there's a lot of people in the city that were connected to Stax and other musical acts. I went to Al Green's church thinking it was going to be this big mega church, and it's not. Again, like I said, people here are just very nonchalant about their ties to the music business. But it was just a good reference material for Intermission, and that's the story is there's the breakup is the backstory. The story is primarily about their lives as regular people. So living here in Memphis provided a lot of material for that.
That sounds awesome. Especially oh my God, Al Green's church. I picture it as like this small little like one-room building for some reason. I don't know why. But
yeah, it's not very big.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you. Lorena, I want to talk about Camilla. She wanted to be a dressmaker when she was a young woman, but later she found the vocation for helping and healing others. What do you make of Camilla's change of heart in what she wanted to do with her life? And did you personally have a dream or a vocation as a child that changed as you grew up?
Okay, so I think that sometimes, especially back then, where people didn't have a lot of choices and opportunities, sometimes you might have a dream, but the situation, like in the case of Camila, didn't present herself that she could be a dressmaker, and so she was kind of forced by circumstances into healing. And after she did it out of admiration for her mentor, that we'll see that in the book, and she then discovers that she's actually good at it, and she does have a passion for it, as her brother does. I personally, honestly, wanted to be a soap opera actress as a little girl. And but I was too shy to ever audition or do anything like that. So after that, I guess I discovered a lot of my family members are artists. And so I discovered that I had some kind of talent in drawing and painting. And so I decided, well, maybe I'll do something with art. I'll be an art director somewhere. And just the circumstances of my life, as in Camila's case, kept changing and giving me some opportunities and taking others. So I ended up figuring out later on, I think I'm a storyteller, because I'm always thinking story. I'm always thinking, I want to write this. Someone should write this book. Someone should write a book about this, I would think, and take notes. So I'd tell this person to write it eventually. And then that person was me, because nobody wanted to write my stories. And so that's kind of how it came to be for me. But I always knew I wanted to do something in the creative field. It's just that life takes you in different directions sometimes.
Absolutely. Okay, Kelsey. Okay, so sometimes authors will talk about certain characters just sort of springing to life fully formed, like out of their skulls. Was that the case for any of your characters in The Woman in the Castello? And on the flip side of that, was there any particular character that was particularly hard to create and put on page?
Yeah, so I think the easiest characters to write were, for me, the characters who were most over the top. And so that was, well, there's quite a few over the top characters, but Gabriella and Terrence both came really naturally because they just are outrageous characters with outrageous dialogue. And so it's always really fun to put that on paper. You can just think of like, what's the craziest thing they could say? And that just like makes sense for their character. So those just, I think sprung out pretty easily. And I think for Terrence, there's also just a lot of real world examples to draw inspiration from. Like he's not based on any one character, but I'm definitely a classic movie fan. And so I've read stories over the years of, like Singing in the Rain, like one of my favorite musicals. Gene Kelly was bullying Debbie Reynolds like the whole time, was absolutely horrible to her. I love Alfred Hitchcock. I love suspense. The Birds, like he assaulted Tippi Hedren on that movie. He ruined her career. He was really, really awful to her. So there's like this unfortunately long history, long tradition of, powerful males in Hollywood mistreating women who are more vulnerable. And so, bringing that to life in Terrence, I think, came really naturally because there's a lot of examples to be inspired by. But I think like it actually made writing Herman's character a little bit harder because I had Terrence like very clear in my mind. He was just kind of like this mean, lecherous drunk who just like insulted Sylvia, every step of the way. But Herman's a bully too, but I wanted to make him a really different kind of bully. I didn't want these characters to really like bleed into each other in any way. So I think that was a little harder. I'd just be a little more thoughtful about how I crafted him. And he's more childish and he really likes to push people's buttons and get his own way. And so I do think hopefully on the page they came, feeling pretty distinct. And, poor Sylvia has a lot of tough people to deal with, but.
Yeah, she's really put through the ringer with that cast and the director. Well, thank you. Kevin, throughout the 1940s set, The Enemy at Home, Nora encounters racism, misogyny, and homophobia. And there's something to be said about how that happens in today's world too. But that was common and sometimes encouraged back in that day. I would like to think that it was less common and less encouraged now, but you don't really know that. So as Nora encounters these injustices, how does her background and the circumstances that she finds herself in influence her response to these encounters? And did you run into any issues in trying to depict these encounters and these injustices?
That's a great question. Yeah, because you walk a fine line because you're writing something set in the 1940s, and yet we have the political correctness and the sensibility that we don't want to use a lot of derogatory terms that were common back then. And especially during the war, there were so many derogatory terms for the Japanese because they were our enemies at the time. So I was really reluctant to use a lot of those terms. That was a big challenge. The other huge challenge was considering Nora's character. This is her first job, and she goes into this workplace, and there's a lot of men resenting women being there, taking their jobs. And there's also the idea that a woman can't do my job just because it kind of gnaws away at their pride. So I couldn't make her like Norma Ray suddenly and be all going in there and shaking things up. So she does kind of, she Blanche is against intolerance in many ways, but she's not hugely active towards it. One of the things I asked myself was, the book takes place in about a month period. And I was wondering if within like few months, will she be more intolerant of injustice? I hope she will be, but I can't make her anachronistic and have her suddenly be have this 2022 sensibility back in 1943. So I think she's about as politically correct as she could be for that time. So that was the big challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Katie, throughout the book, we learned that some of the crimes that Lottie solved as a kid detective. Which one of the mysteries that she solved has been your favorite?
Yeah, there are a bunch mentioned. Some of them are in like detail, and some of them are just like thrown out there in passing, like, yeah, there's a train car full of snakes, and you just gotta wonder about that. I think that my favorite is probably, or at least, I think I have a soft spot for the case of the missing school supplies, which is already in itself in the title, that's a kid detective case. That's a case that a child is solving. But it was like her first like real case that she solved when she was in kindergarten. And so that's just kind of like a pinnacle moment for her. It's also like when she meets her best friend, who becomes like a very important person in her life. And it's just it's got a lot of the aspects of a kid detective mystery, that, it's got hiding in closets and, finding things for your classmates and all of that. I think there is another case in the book that I did really like that ended up getting sort of cut down for time when I was going through it, and I was like, oh, we don't need this whole scene here. There are aspects throughout the book, or these moments throughout the book, that are little like notes, messages, report cards, newspaper articles, things from Charlotte's past. And I ended up taking this one mystery where she was recovering stolen money from a fundraiser, that I had written out as a whole scene, and ended up cutting that down to just a short little note that she passed to her friend in class. So that's just like a beginning of a chapter where it's just this little note from Lottie Isles, younger Charlotte, talking about this case that she solved. But I do like that, just because it was sort of, I thought I was going to have to cut this whole scene that I had written where she was hiding in the trunk of someone's car and doing all this stuff, and ending up being able to kind of shift that and change that so it could still stay in the story, just in a more condensed form. I do really like that little case too.
Well, thank you very much. That was
Thank you.
awesome. Like, I love how you thread those through, and it's just a nice little, shows how Charlotte and Lottie, how Lottie becomes Charlotte in some ways.
Yeah.
Okay, so Phyllis, okay, I want to ask you about Intermission being at its core a story of forgiveness. And can you discuss the ways that the theme of forgiveness is woven throughout the novel?
Sure. Well, the theme of forgiveness runs throughout the story, because in order for the individuals to move forward, the girls, and I guess they're women by the end of the story, but it's like Miss Glow in the story, they're my girls. So the girls have to reconcile the past. And, we always hear that forgiveness is for you. It's not for the other person. You'll still be stewing over something and carrying a grudge and mad about something, and the other person has gone on their merry way. They aren't even thinking about you. So that's sort of comes part of the storyline here also. And some of the issues that led to the breakup were real, but some were not. But the other person perceived it as real, so it still had the same impact on their life. So that's another thing to kind of think about. And then also the story is about forgiving yourself for mistakes and the woulda, couldas, in our past, and many of us are often harder on ourselves than anyone else would ever be. The introductory preamble to the book states the first to apologize is the bravest, the first to forgive is the strongest, and the first to forget is the happiest. So forgiving isn't easy, but life is easier when you do forgive. And that's kind of the message of the story.
That's really beautiful. I'm a fan of that phrase that you read. I like that very much. Okay, Lorena, we learned that Puri's sister Angelica, who also appears in The Spanish Daughter, has been committed to a mental institution for, quote, going into hysterics. Lucas mentions to her a variety of reasons as to why women could be committed in the past. Have you heard, in your research, did you hear about real life cases like this? And what did you draw to help sort of pull that all together in The Queen of the Valley?
Okay, so yeah, actually I have someone that shall remain unnamed told me that when she was well, she's an older lady now, but when I think this was in the 50s, she came from a family in Nebraska that was very Catholic, and she fell in love with a Jewish man, and her father had her committed so she wouldn't marry the Jewish man. And so she was there for some time. I can't recall how long, but eventually she got out and married the guy. So didn't really work. But I started researching a little bit of that, and I came across this crazy list of reasons for admission from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which include the most preposterous things, like kicked in the head by a horse, imaginary female troubles, hysteria, immoral life, laziness, novel reading. So all of us would be committed. Like, there is just so many things in that list. I thought it was like a joke, but I don't know. I think there's some truth to it. Maybe this list is a little bit exaggerated. I don't know exactly how it was in Cali, but I did find the asylum. So they had it during those times, the one that I do mention in the book where she's committed to. So at least they have that. I may have taken some literary freedoms because I don't know how, the real reasons for that, but it fit, it fit that she went into hysterics. Plus, there might have been some ulterior motives for one of the characters who is a powerful doctor to commit her. So I figured, yeah, I think it fits. But yeah, so I think people were committed for crazy things back then. But
all right. Well, thank you.
I encourage you guys to look up that list.
It'll be the next thing I Google.
Okay.
Okay, Kelsey, I want to talk to you about how you depict motherhood through various characters in The Woman in the Castello. You have a single mother who's, under a lot of stress between her career and her daughter and her life. You have her mother who is becoming a burden to her. And then you have, the bombshell actress and the sort of haunted, ghostly aunt in the castle. So as an overall subject in the book, how do you see motherhood fitting in, and how did that shape all of those characters that I just mentioned?
Yeah, I think what they all have in common is that they were operating outside of societal norms for the time. So we have Sylvia, who's a young, unwed mother. So, she has no husband or father to support her. Her own mother was widowed young and had to be a working mother and raise her by herself in a time period when that wasn't very common. And then we have, Lucrezia and Gabriella, who are both very focused on their careers and their fame and over family at the time. And then we have, the movie within the book that's being filmed is this horror movie, and horror movies for, in the 60s and other decades, a really common theme that they explored, that people were scared of, was the corruption of female virtue and really the destruction of the nuclear family. You can kind of think of like any monster movie you can think of. It's about, the lady getting kidnapped and they have to rescue her and save her virtue. And it's really about the threat to the patriarchy at its core. It's about the other coming and taking your women and taking your way of life. And so I really loved that really all of the women in this novel were in contrast to this movie that Herman was trying to film, that was this very traditional message of, the ingenue who's going to have the white wedding and resist to the temptation of the witch. And you have all these really strong women who have had to make their way, without a support system, and outside of the traditional family model. And I think, I wrote this book in the first half of 2020. So I think I was a mother of a 2-year-old. Things at work were unstable, not going well. I actually was laid off from my job while pregnant. The very same day I turned in the first draft of this book to my agent. And so I think all of that juggling act and those tensions definitely crept their way into the story. And I think the pandemic upended support systems for a lot of people. And so these women, who had to, in the book, do without them, I think that's very relatable, for many parents, mothers or not. And so I think, still very much a relatable theme today.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, I can't get to the last round of questions, so I can't ask you about Revenge of the Lake Witch. But that's the name of the movie within Kelsey's book. So I'm gonna actually do a little lightning round, a single question for all of you. We have most of our attendees are booksellers and librarians. So starting with Kevin in the same order that we have been going in, growing up, and what was your relationship with your local bookstore or your library? And did you bring yourself to, or did your parents take you to one or the other? Did you spend a lot of time in libraries or bookstores?
Oh yeah, I was not a popular kid growing up, so I was. I know it's tragic. So the library was my just my sanctuary, and there was a bookstore. There was one bookstore in Glencoe, Illinois, and I used to go there every week. That was one of the spots. But I would go to the library and go down to the basement and look through all the periodicals, like the Old Life magazines and Old Time magazines, and look. And just get lost there for hours. And yeah, so I was a big fan of the library. And so, in fact, one of my heroines of one of my books, I think it's Hide Your Fear, is a librarian. So I owe my childhood to libraries. So yeah, I'm in debt to them.
Katie, how about you? Same question.
Yeah, I was a big library kid. I've actually been sort of renewing my my love of the library and my presence in the library. I sort of fell off with I was a big reader growing up, and I sort of fell off in college, just with everything that was going on. And also what I used to do is, I'd go to the library, I'd go to the, the children's section or the young adult section when I got to that age, and just, look at the new shelf and see what was there. And that's kind of how I got my book recommendations. And then, when I was in college, I really wasn't getting, I wasn't going to the library, so I wasn't getting those book recommendations. So I just wasn't reading. And actually it's thanks to Book Talk that I started getting book recommendations that got me back into reading. So I've been going back to the library and getting those books and kind of realizing my love of the library. And I actually hit a great moment the other day that I went to pick up a book that I had on hold, and the librarian went to get the book before scanning my library card, and I didn't even process it at first until then. They asked for my card, and I realized that they just recognized me and knew me by name and knew that it was my book to get. So I was that really made me happy that I was like, I'm back with the library and me, we're tight.
That's amazing. How about you, Phyllis?
Also, continuous early love affair with the library. Actually, that's sort of was my first job when I was in high school, maybe like 10th grade, I guess. I was a library monitor. And so that was like seventh heaven because I could see all the new books as they came in. And my mother, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My mother's and family is originally from Arkansas. And you know, your parents tell you these stories, you know, about how hard they had it when they grew up and all of that kind of stuff. And at some, I don't know what we were talking about, and I said something about the library. And she said, well, no, we couldn't go to the library. And I mean, I had heard about discrimination and segregation and marching and all that stuff, but you know, you're a kid, you don't think about all that. But then when she said that they could not go to the library, that just made me so sad. And that's when it just actually, you know, the depth of, you know, what my parents and other people had gone through. That's kind of when it hit me, when she told me that they couldn't go to the library when she was a kid.
It's appalling still. Lorena, you're up.
Well, I wish I could, like all these wonderful writers, say that I grew up in libraries, but the truth is, I am originally from Ecuador, and in Ecuador, we don't have a public library system. There's only libraries and schools and universities and stuff. I think that if I had had one, then maybe I would have gone, but I have to be honest and confess that when I was in the 3rd grade and I had to read for the first time a book that was not with pictures, I was not too happy about it. And I ended up falsifying the reading log, pretending that I had read Heidi more than I had. And of course I got caught and then had to go through the shame of being scolded by my mother. And then I started reading the book and I was actually, hey, this is not too bad. This is actually pretty good. And next year, this really cool girl came to my school and she liked me and she was like my best friend and she was a big reader. So she was like, hey, let's go to the school library, which there was nobody there by the librarian. And her and I would just go during recess and we would read to one another. And she got me into reading because I was the kid that didn't want to read a chapter book, you know? So that's kind of how it started for us. And then from then on, I started giving reading a chance, but it took a little bit for me to start.
What a good story, though. What a good friend.
I know, she's still like a huge reader.
Oh, that's awesome. Kelsey, in the last dying moments we have together.
Yeah, I was always a library kid. I was an early reader. My school didn't typically read, like, you know, have reading as like part of the main curriculum for kindergarten, but I got special permission to get library books and read because I was reading at that point. I'm actually the sister of a librarian, which is, so clearly it runs in the family. She's a California state librarian for government documents. And my 3rd book that I'm writing right now is set in California. So I get to actually use her as a resource, which is like a dream come true. And now I have little kids who we get to take them to the local library. So, you know, just passing it along, and it's so much fun to get to experience that through their eyes.
Oh, well, thank you. I will say that in my elementary school, middle school, they had like this one small library. And I typically went there to take out like Hardy Boys books, but also any book that would teach me how to become a ninja and like learning karate. That was very popular. So to everyone who attended today, thank you. This has been the sort of summer fiction showcase of our Kensington Upfronts. And thank you to Kelsey James, whose book The Woman in the Castello comes out July 25th. Lorena Hughes, whose book The Queen of the Valley is August 22nd. Intermission by Phyllis Dixon, which is July 25th.
July.
Yep. Katie Siegel's Charlotte Isles is Not a Detective, which is coming out on June 27th. And last but not least, Kevin James's The Enemy at Home, which is coming out August 22nd as well. To all my authors, thank you very much. You've just been really charming and a wonderful delight. And yeah, when this recording gets edited and put online, I'll send you all a link.
Thank you so much for having
Thank
us.
you.
Matt. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Matt.
We'll all be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.